we have reached the end here, or close to the end. So what are we going to spend the last couple of days talking about? Well, to this point in the class, we have largely focused on the US economy, right? And of course, we have talked about other countries here and there. We've used examples from other countries, but we haven't really expanded our scope much beyond the United States, and particularly a lot of international issues that pertain to macroeconomics. And so that's really where we're going to spend our last couple of days here. Oops. Spend our last couple of days here talking about international macro. Not internal macro. Got it. Let's try this all again here. International macro. All right, good. And so what we talk about here the next couple of days, there is going to be a little bit from chapter 5 that I'm going to cover today. I did not assign you to read chapter 5 because there's just a couple of little topics that I'm going to pick out. But most of what we talk about here the last couple of days is going to be from chapter 18. And it will take us today and tomorrow to get through all of this, right? So this is the last chapter. So what are some of the topics that we're going to be talking about here to end the class? We're going to be going back and talking about the benefits of trade. We're going to spend some time talking about trade deficits or trade balances and capital flows. We're going to talk about exchange rates, what determines them. We're going to talk about monetary policy and how monetary policy can be used to manage exchange rates. So these are just some of the bigger topics, and of course we'll be talking, related to this. This is the choice between fixed and floating exchange rates. Okay. So what does it mean to fix your exchange rate and floating your exchange rate? So these are some of the big topics that we'll be talking about here the last couple of days. Just so you have a little bit of a roadmap to where we're going. Now, this first question is where we're going to begin, right? What are the benefits of international trade? Listen, we've talked about this a lot, right? And I guess it's a testament to how important international trade is and understanding the benefits of trade that I've probably talked about this on at least 3 other occasions in this class. And we're going to do it again today, right? So you help me out. What are some of the benefits of international trade? What are some of the things that we've talked about as to why countries benefit from trade?
We talked about specialization and lower opportunity cost producers.
Yes. Right? That's the big one. Specialization and the idea, the concept of comparative advantage, right? That you can specialize in what you do best, meaning you can make things at the lowest opportunity cost. And so even countries that are more productive at everything can still benefit by specializing in what they do best, right? So you remember that whole stupid example I gave you about LeBron James mowing his lawn, right? Well, to some extent, when it comes to international trade, the U.S. is kind of LeBron James, right? We're more productive at producing most things than most other countries. But that doesn't mean that we can't benefit from trade. So this is the main thing we've talked about, but I think there's some other things that we've talked about here throughout the block that as other benefits of trade. Who can help me out with some of the other things? Brenna says transfer technology. Yes. When you trade goods, you're not just trading goods, you're also trading ideas. And so one way that many countries have kind of moved up the technology ladder is through trade, right? So you think about a country like, well, South Korea is the classic example. I think I mentioned to you that when I was a kid, where was the cheapest stuff in the world made? South Korea. But basically, South Korea began to specialize in just, very, kind of low technology, labor intensive manufacturing goods. But as they got better at that, they began to develop their human capital, their access to technology, and gradually moved up and up the technology ladder as they began to produce more and more technical, highly specialized goods. And then we get to today where South Korea in many ways is right at the forefront of technology, right? You think about companies like Hyundai and Samsung, right, are really out there competing with, the most technologically advanced companies in the world. It's a testament to the role that trade can play in helping you build up your technology. And we know from class that technology is the number one source of growth, right? This is the biggest source of growth. And so the ability of trade to help you catch up in technology is super important, right? Super important. Anybody have some other ideas that we've talked about? Let me just mention a couple of things. We've talked less about these, but I think they're worth mentioning. There is a good argument that technology improves institutions. Right? For many countries, the movement toward having more trade means that they've had to change their practices, their laws, and adopt more international standards. Which has helped them improve their institutions, right? So international standards in terms of, for instance, like accounting standards, international standards in terms of manufacturing standards, engineering standards, right? These are the kind of things that have helped them improve their institutions. So we could keep on and on, but I would say these are three of the more persuasive arguments for why trade is so important. And as we've talked about, one of the strongest facts that we have in macroeconomics is that countries that trade more grow faster, right? Countries that trade more grow faster. Now, I'm sure you've heard of this concept, globalization, right? And globalization basically means the growth in international trade and financial linkages. And that's something we're going to talk a lot about here today, is that globalization is not just in terms of trade in goods and services, but it's also trade in financial services, right? Savings and investing across countries. And this really has been taking place, it's hard to say exactly when it started, but roughly since the 1980s is when we've seen this recent boom in globalization. So let me just show you a couple of figures here to get some idea of what we're talking about. First off, if we look here on the left at the growth of world trade. So this is looking at kind of the world economy, right? Putting all the economies in the world together into one big pot and looking at how much trade is as a percent of world GDP. And you can see now that trade has really risen above where it was at any point in history, right? Many people refer to today's era as the second era of globalization. Because if you look back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we actually had the first era of globalization. But that first era of globalization fell apart between the Great Depression and the two world wars. Since, basically the 1970s, we've had this big takeoff in world trade, where today, this is kind of an amazing figure. More than 50% right, of GDP is traded internationally, right? More than 50% of GDP is traded internationally. So almost half of everything that's produced actually crosses borders. And you can see this if you look to the right-hand side, how internationalized some economies are, right? So countries like Belgium, Canada, Germany have at or more than 50% of their GDP in imports and exports, right? Look at Belgium, right? 85% in imports and 87% in exports, right? I mean, almost everything produced in Belgium is either imported and exported. And that makes sense, right? Belgium's a small country. I mean, Belgium's like Iowa, right? What sense would it make for Iowa to set up a border and not trade with Minnesota, Illinois, or Missouri, right? It makes no sense. And the same really holds for Belgium. And so, you won't be surprised to know that the smaller a country is, the more they can gain from specialization, right? Because they're not going to be able to be generalists. And so it's not surprising that many of these smaller countries are even more dependent on international trade, and that in general, the bigger a country is, the less that you depend upon for international trade. So you see here, among these countries, the biggest ones, the US and China, also are the countries that depend the least on trade, right? Which makes sense. What's driving all this globalization? Can we say what factors are driving globalization? Help me out here. What are some of the things you think are driving this? Any ideas?
Is one thing that just like it's really easy to communicate now. It's not a telegraph. You can actually call a person or Zoom them for, so you can have a lot easier communication.
Right, growing information technology. Yeah, undoubtedly, this plays a really big role, Logan. If you read some books, for instance, read some books on some entrepreneurs who are some of the first Americans to work in China, right? After China kind of opened up their economy. Going to set up a business in China was, or to find like some manufacturer that could produce a little widget for your good, it was kind of like going into the jungle, right? Like, you just kind of go out there and you're kind of on your own and you're just wandering around, you're not knowing what's going on. Today, I mean, you're right. I mean, there are companies that basically specialize in finding other companies to produce your good. And because of information technology, there's just such better information. Better information and communication have definitely driven this, right? Have definitely driven this. But Sunny mentioned something else, which is also part of technology. The fall in transport costs. First off, there's just the growth of virtual services, right? Now you can get services internationally, virtually, at very, very low cost, right? So you can have somebody in India read your X-ray, right, for almost nothing, right? The cost of doing that is almost nothing. That has significantly reduced the cost of using services across countries. Just as importantly, one of the great inventions of the 20th century is something that almost none of us has spent any time thinking about, which is the growth of cargo containers and long-haul shipping, right? This has greatly reduced the costs of moving goods from one country to the other, right? Greatly. you could make an argument that we would not have had the Chinese economic boom that we've had without the invention of cargo container shipping, right? So if any of you have ever been to a port, it's really very interesting, and I highly encourage you, if you ever get a chance to do this, to go do it. But cargo container shipping is one of those ideas that seems so simple. But when you see it in practice, you see what great value it has, right? Everything becomes standardized, right? A cargo container is a standardized measurement. Basically, you can, if you're a producer, you can buy or rent a cargo container, jam everything in it. It can then very easily be put onto a flatbed truck, taken to a port. A port has cranes that will pick it up and stack it onto a shipping, a long-haul ship. On these long-haul ships, you can get thousands of these cargo containers. They make the long trip over, right? You take another cargo, or you take another crane, you pick it off the ship, you put it on a truck, and then it hits the road, right? Any guesses how much it costs to move a cargo container from Shanghai to Los Angeles? To move a cargo container from Shanghai to Los Angeles costs about $120. Right. That's why there has been such a big increase in international trade, is because it's become so cheap to move goods from here to there, right? And so Sunny notes, I didn't even know this, the cargo containers were created in 1956. If you actually go back and look at that graph, you see really it was 1950s where this kind of boom in international trade took off, right? How much would it cost to send a container from the US to China? I don't know. It'd probably be even cheaper than that, Sonny, because one of the things you know about if you follow this is that in the cargo container business, cargo containers that come from China to the US are pretty full. Cargo containers that go from the US back to China are pretty empty. So in general, it costs less to ship it from the US to China than it does to ship it from China to the US, right? So yeah, these are things that probably most of us have never thought about, but it played a huge role in international trade. What else has played a role in driving globalization? Well, one thing undoubtedly is changes in policy. Okay. More and more countries are following policies of export promotion, meaning focusing on economic policies in which exporting is central to their development strategy. And as a result, more countries have joined the global trade system. So today we really have more countries that have joined the global trade system than we've ever had in the past. So you can see here in this figure, this shows up all right, but this is the number of countries that have joined the World Trade System. And I'll talk here in a minute about what the World Trade System is, but it's basically joining the World Trade Organization. And so you can see the number of countries that have joined the World Trade Organization, upwards of over 160 countries, right? So, what do we have today roughly in the world? We have something like 182 countries. So, basically all but about 20 countries or so have joined the World Trade Organization in some way, shape, or form. And so related to this, you also have countries that have done more than just join the World Trade Organization, that have joined free trade zones, right? Including the United States, that has a free trade zone with Canada and Mexico, right? So more and more countries have opened up policy, particularly over the last 30 to 40 years. And once again, I think this is just a testament to how successful it's been, right? It's put a lot of pressure on countries that were not open to open up. All right. Something else that has definitely played a role is that we basically have developed a taste, and culture to some extent has changed to become more open, somewhat more international, right? I mean, I can only just talk about this from my own perspective. I've got a couple of older daughters who are in college, your age, and I just see the kind of things that they watch. One of my daughters watches anime all the time, right? That was probably not something that would have happened 20 or 30 years ago, right? Same for whether you're talking about music or whether you're talking about food. Not all of this has been good, Korean pop, okay, but a lot of it has been very good, right? Korean food. So, I think in many ways our tastes have changed so that we want more imports and exports than we used to. The final part of this, and this is really important to understand, and you'll hear me talk a lot about this here today, is the growth of global supply chains. This is a word that gets tossed around a lot. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly do we mean by global supply chains. Okay. And I hope this discussion kind of fundamentally changes how you think about trade, because there is probably nothing that people understand less than global supply chains, right? Many people hear global supply chains and they just think, oh, exports and imports. That's not really what we're talking about, right? What global supply chains means is that goods are not specialized at the final stage of production anymore. And by that I mean, the US is not specializing in making computers. China is not specializing in making steel, right? Countries do not specialize at the final stage of production. Instead, what are they trading in? They're trading in stages of production, not final goods, not just final goods. Okay? So trade between countries is not in final goods. It is largely in intermediate goods. And it's just amazing how few people actually understand what is going on here. So to illustrate this, that hopefully to try to make this clear, let me show you a breakdown of a good that many of you are somewhat familiar with. Here is an Apple iPad, okay? Now, this Apple iPad sells for $500, okay? Technically, this Apple iPad is an import into the United States. Why? Because where is the final stage of production take place? In China. The final stage of production, in other words, final assembly and putting it in the box, takes place in China. So when we think about exports and imports, we think about them in final goods. And so this is technically an import into the United States and an export to China. But the crazy thing about this is that this is in almost no way, shape, or form a Chinese good, right? Of that $500, how much of that $500 actually goes to China? $8. $8 of that $500 actually goes to China. Everything else goes all across the world, including Apple, which gets the biggest chunk of it, $150. That's basically for the intellectual property, right? The ideas that went into this. And then you can see subcontractors, South Korea, $34. That's mainly the computer chips. Unidentified countries, other United States companies, $12. Japan, $7. Taiwan, $7. European Union, $2, right? So this iPad is really from a bunch of different countries. But how do we tend to count exports and imports? We look at them at the final stage, right? The final good. And so because the final good is assembled in China, we call it an export to the United States, even though the US is getting far and away the most money out of this.
So if we had something, sorry, so if we had something like all these parts were assembled in other countries and then all the parts were brought here and it was like assembled in America, would it say like made in America?
Yes. Yeah. So I actually should show you, I bought a drill this weekend. And on the drill, there's a big sticker that said, assembled in America, in big letters. And then in little letters, it said, from International Parts. Right. I mean, it doesn't, it's meaningless, right? It's meaningless. Probably if we went down and did this kind of analysis for that drill's probably less American than an iPad is. My guess is. But, you know, this is the way that we do our international accounting. The problem is, honestly, that there's no way that you can do this for every single good, right? I mean, you can see how difficult this is because global supply chains are so complicated to track down every little input for every single good and where it is. I mean, it would be immensely complicated. So what do we tend to do? We just look at the final stage, right? We just count final goods. But what that's doing is that's giving us a very, very misleading picture about what's going on. And so one of the things I'm going to talk to you, mention many times here is that in many ways, our trade balance statistics are meaningless. They really are fairly meaningless because we're really not measuring the true cost of goods coming into our country or going out of our country. To think of another example, look here at a Boeing 787. Let me shrink this down a little bit. And once again, you see almost the impossibility. Sorry, this is a little cockeyed. I don't know what I did here. But you can see almost the impossibility of thinking about this as belonging to any single country. So to your point, Zach, this Boeing 787 is actually a US good because it is assembled in the United States, right? But if you actually look at where all the pieces of it are from all over the globe, right? And actually relatively little of the actual plane is produced in the US, right? The engines, at least one engine, wing to body fairing, right? Rear fuselage, but I mean, for the most part, this is really produced across the globe. And so in many ways, what I'm trying to say is, what do exports and imports really mean nowadays? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. hopefully you can also though see from this discussion why COVID had the potential to do so much disruption. Because every single good is being produced in thousands of different places, right? And so when goods are produced in thousands of different places, that really creates a lot of potential bottlenecks, right? If something happens in one country, right? So, you know, for instance, if something happens in India, right, which is going on right now in COVID, right, what we see is that a lot of Indian manufacturing is really taking a hit right now. And so what's that impacting? That's impacting, for instance, pharmaceuticals, which India tends to be very high or very good at or specialize a lot in, a lot of software and IT development, steel manufacturing, right? And those are where we're seeing some bottlenecks because COVID is hitting India particularly hard. So it's going to hit those industries very hard. Okay. Related to the idea of global supply chains, though, is the idea of multinational corporations. And you also have to understand this if you want to have a clear picture of what's happening in international trade nowadays. These are corporations that basically work across borders, right? And most of the corporations that we're familiar with are in fact multinational corporations. The thing about these firms is that they both import and export a great deal. And as a result, this idea that somehow you can stop imports without stopping exports is stupidity, right? It's stupidity. This idea that somehow the US can import less, but keep on exporting the same amount that we're doing is just stupidity, right? Because that's not the way that the world works. Who's doing the importing? The same companies that are also doing the exporting, right? And you can't stop one without doing the other. So this is a little hard to read. Blow it up here. Probably the easiest one, the left-hand side is maybe a little confusing, but let's focus on the right-hand side. Okay. If you look at the first circle here on the right-hand side, if you look at the top 1% of US exporters, right? So in other words, the biggest 1% of firms that do most of the exporting, 90% of them are also doing importing, right? And then if you look at the other circle of the top 1% US importers, 96% are also doing exporting, right? So our biggest importers are also doing exporting. Our biggest exporters are also doing importing, right? This is the nature of modern economics and our modern economy, is that in many ways, importing and exporting are the flip sides of the same coin. You import an intermediate good, you add some more work to it, and then you export it to another country where more work gets added, and then you export it again, right? In this kind of situation, it's becoming really hard to say what is an export, what is an import, and what your true trade balance is, right? So these are just all very important facts that really, I think, inform or should inform how we think about trade, right? And, you know, unfortunately, none of these facts, as I see it, are really reflected in most of our political discussions about trade, right? Because, you know, listen, when you hear politicians talk about trade, it's almost like they're back in the 1920s, right? It's like, well, we trade corn and we get cars. You know, I mean, that's so far from reality nowadays about how trade actually works that it's kind of like also thinking like we're trading for horses and buggies too. I mean, it is really that out of date. And so, yeah, you know, but unfortunately our political discussions don't reflect the reality of modern trade. Which of course leads to this next question of, you know, if trade is so great, and I've been telling you this idea that trade is so great, then why is trade protectionism so popular? And I'm sure you've all heard it. Some of you might believe it, right? That the U.S. should trade better, or, you know, or trade less. That somehow we'd be better off if we didn't trade with other countries.
Can you switch back to your iPad, please?
Yeah, sorry. So why is trade protectionism so popular? Or another way of saying this is why is trade so unpopular? And Faith, I think you hit on the big one, right? Is it creates winners and losers. We talked about, I think, the second day of class. This is the condition for special interest politics. Because the costs of trade are highly concentrated, it creates this phenomena of one issue voters. Voters who care about one thing. In this case, stopping trade because they personally have a lot to lose from it. Even though the economy in general might gain, some people have a lot to lose. So this is true in the sense that trade is good in the aggregate, right? It's good in the aggregate. That doesn't mean that every single person is going to benefit from it. And that creates a problem. What are some of the other arguments that you hear against trade? What are some of the other arguments that you hear against trade? Come on, I know you guys have sat around the dinner table and heard some family members complaining. Yeah, Sunny says the loss of jobs, right? It costs us jobs. But really, once again, this goes back to the issue we just talked about. Sorry. What it really creates is job churning, meaning, I think I've described this. Some jobs destroyed, some created. But of course, which ones do people tend to focus on? They tend to focus on the jobs that are destroyed, right? So when it comes to trade, everybody thinks about the fact that we don't manufacture shoes anymore in the United States, right? And they say, oh, well, trade's killing us. We don't make shoes anymore. Of course, they don't focus on the fact that there's a lot of things that we do make in the United States, right? So it creates some jobs, but it destroys other ones. People tend to focus on the jobs that get destroyed, right? This one is really just related to the point number one. Another idea that's related to this one is some people I've heard make the claim that the U.S. can't compete with low-wage countries. Somehow the US can't compete with low-wage countries. Their wages are so cheap, so of course we can't compete with them. Okay, so this one you hear all the time, and it's one of those things that really kind of sounds smart until you think about it, and then you realize that it's really, really kind of dumb, right? First off, do we see companies locating to the lowest wage areas? No, listen, if companies just went to the lowest wage, everybody would be moving to Haiti. Nobody's moving to Haiti, right? Why are wages so low in Haiti? Well, what we've learned in this class tells us why. What's true about countries that have low standards of living? They have low productivity. Low wages reflect low productivity. Why does Haiti have low productivity? Because they have very little human capital, physical capital, and technology. Why would a company want to locate to a place where they have very little human capital, physical capital, and technology? They wouldn't. And that's why we don't see people moving to Haiti or companies moving to Haiti, right? The thing about trade is you want high wages, right? The key and to why many countries are so anxious to become a part of the global trading system is you want your wages to go up and not to be a low wage country, right? Being a low wage country is not a very successful development strategy, right? Your development goal should be to be a high wage country, right? So, you can see this if you actually look at what's happened to wages in many less developed countries over time, right? Or not just less developed countries, all countries. You can see the wage here on the vertical, right? What your average median wage is. And on the right, you can see productivity. Countries that have higher productivity have higher wages. Not surprising, right? This is just pretty simple economics. And so the idea behind becoming part of the global trading system and trading more is so that your wages go up as a result of driving up productivity, right? So companies are not just looking at low wages, right? We know this, right? Companies just aren't out there trying to minimize their wage costs. They're also looking for human capital, physical capital, and technology. That's ultimately what they're looking for. And so, this idea that somehow wages are the only thing that firms look at, I just don't think it reflects an idea about economics that just is not consistent with the real world. Anybody think of some other arguments against trade? I can think of a couple that I hear a lot. One is the kind of national security argument. Don't we put ourselves in some danger when we trade with other countries? This happened a lot with masks at the beginning of the COVID crisis. People figured out that actually there was, I think, maybe only one US company that was making masks, like healthcare masks, at the beginning of the crisis. And so many people said, how can that be, right? Oh, we have to get our masks from China? How can a great country like the US get their masks from China, right? And to some extent kind of blaming China for the lack of masks, when in essence it was a global shortage, right? It wasn't just a US shortage, it was a global shortage. And so this—
The other thing I've heard—
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
My bad.
Zach.
The other thing I've heard is like the other countries are like producing too much of our pharmaceuticals, like our drugs and stuff. And a lot of people got like angry about that. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. And you know what? This has happened. We could pick 50 examples of this. Currently, The US government subsidizes wool manufacturing so that we have some wool manufacturers in the US. Sugar, cotton, the list goes on and on of things that the federal government subsidizes so that they're produced here. Why do we need a wool subsidy? Well, because if we don't subsidize wool manufacturing in the United States, then all our wool is going to be made in New Zealand. And I mean, we can't trust those Kiwis. You cannot trust them. What happens if we go to war with New Zealand? We will have naked soldiers, and we can't have that. So we're going to subsidize wool manufacturing. The same for cotton, right? The cotton subsidy is absolutely insane. In Texas alone, right? In the state of Texas alone, there are 300 farmers who get cotton subsidies at about $150,000 a year, right? $150,000 a year to 300 cotton. Why? Because, honestly, because of market prices, most cotton should be grown in West Africa. That's probably the area that has comparative advantage. But because these cotton manufacturers have basically gotten a sweet deal in Congress, they get these huge subsidies that help pay them to produce very inefficient cotton, right? It's crazy, right? It's crazy. These kind of subsidies basically cost roughly between 10 billion and 20 billion a year, the federal government. This is nothing but a giveaway. It really is a giveaway. And largely, I mean, of course, I take a very cynical view of this, but what do I see this as? I just see this as a way of people trying to get rich, right? And if you can blame the other guy and strike up a fear of international trade, then why not do it, right? If you can, I thought it was very interesting. I remember during COVID, actually was watching a news program in which the one American company that made masks, the owner was interviewed. And he could not have said the word China more than if he was in a fine dining instrument store, right? I mean, it was China this and China that. It was very clear that he was trying to sell a fear of China as a way to get a big government subsidy, right, for his business. And, I mean, so I take a very cynical view of this, that a lot of this is just people trying to get a big government bailout, right? It has very little to do with national security and has a lot more about, getting a cushy subsidy from the government. And then I think the final thing that many people talk about is that international trade leads to trade deficits. In other words, the fact that we trade creates trade deficits for the United States, that we get screwed over. Of course, what do we know? Our trade deficits reflect domestic policy. They reflect domestic policy. If you remember from earlier in the class, we developed this equation. S minus M is equal to X minus M. Our trade debt balance reflects the difference between savings and investment. So what's true about us here in the US? We have low savings relative to our investment. What does that mean? we run a trade deficit, and we have how should I say this, net foreign savings is less than zero. In other words, we're a borrower. Okay? We know from this equation that whenever you have low savings relative to investment, you are going to be running a trade deficit. And you are also going to be a foreign borrower. That's essentially how you pay for it. So if you have low savings relative to I, according to this equation, and this is just math, right? This is just math. If you have low savings relative to investment, you will run a trade deficit and you will be a net foreign borrower. It's determined by our savings and investment. It's not determined by other countries screwing us over. If you think trade deficits are a bad thing, then it's we who are screwing ourselves over. Why? Because we save too little relative to investment. Okay? That's what ultimately determines our trade balance. The fact that so many politicians on both sides of the aisle don't understand this is really what all I can call is a willful ignorance. It's so much easier to blame China for our trade deficit as opposed to blaming math. And so that's what happens. There's no better evidence of this than what happened under Trump, where Trump came into office complaining about the trade deficit, how he's going to reduce the trade deficit. What happened to the trade deficit under Trump? It went up, right? Here's the trade deficit. Trump takes over in 2017. Look what happened to the trade deficit. It's continued to go up. Why did it continue to go up? Because what happened to government budget deficits? They went up. So when the deficit went up, our savings went down, S got that much further below I, and our trade deficit went up. So despite all the posturing, despite all the trade war stuff with China, despite this and that, right? Did our trade deficit go down? No, because the math didn't change. Right? Math did not change. You can start a trade war, but you can't change math. And that's basically what this equation tells you, right? That S minus I determines our trade balance. And so, one of the things that we've seen increasingly here in the US is what we could call the twin deficits. And what are the twin deficits? That are government budget deficits lead to a reduction in our national savings, which means that S stays lower than I and means that our trade deficit goes up, right? So government budget deficits drive up trade deficits. That's what we mean by the twin deficits. And that's what we've really seen, right? That's what we've really seen here over the last, well, not just under Trump. We've actually seen it happening before Trump. And quite honestly, we're going to see it happen under Biden too, right? Because we all know what's happened to government budget deficits here the last, here the first 3 or 4 months of the Biden administration. They're going up. And so this trade deficit is going to get worse, right? And it's not because of something that other countries are doing. It's a simple reflection of economics, right? It's a simple reflection of economics. Okay, why don't we take a little break, right? That's enough of me yelling. Yeah, let's take a break, about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about World Trade Organizations and capital flows, all right? See you in a couple minutes. Hey, everybody. I always feel like I'm calling everybody out of his sleep, right? Like, wake up, wake up. So much economics to learn. Come on. You all want to just stay in that pleasant slumber land, right? You're having your nice dreams, and I'm calling you back to the reality of trade deficits and government policy, right? All right, let's talk a little bit about trade organizations and kind of the, how should I say this, the kind of the global, the global structure of trade, right? How do countries organize themselves? And what are the rules of trade, right? What are the rules by which countries trade with each other? So there are many, many different overlapping organizations. And I think one of the challenging parts of this is it's just hard to, there's, how should I say this? International trade organizations, there's a lot of different organizations with overlapping goals. It's just kind of a mess, right? There is no kind of one set of rules for trade. Just looking right today. So when countries engage in trade, there is just no one set of rules. There are, in essence, a lot of there's a lot of overlapping rules. So let's just kind of talk about this a little bit. First off, why do I keep on writing? Really? I really can't get my brain jump started this morning. Okay, so there's first a set of what we'll call international or global rules. And these are, the most important of these is the World Trade Organization, often referred to as the WTO. This is the biggest organization or biggest agreement between the most countries. Right now, this has 164 countries in it. So most of the countries of the world. It is approximately 24,000 pages long. It gives you some idea of the complexity of this thing. There is essentially a judicial process. Maybe I'm saying this in the wrong order. So the WTO does create rules for tariffs and other trade practices. What's a legal tariff that you can charge? What's an illegal tariff? What is a kind of legal trade practice and what's an illegal trade practice? If another country is engaging in an illegal trade practice, then you can sue them, right? There's a judicial process. And basically how that judicial process acts is, you know, for instance, if the US does something illegal and they're found to do something illegal, then the country they did something illegal against can then do something illegal against the United States, right? It's kind of a tit for tat, right? So inevitably, when the US engages in something illegal, what does the other country do? They try to put a tariff on US corn or something that they feel will be very, very painful to the US. So it's very much a kind of a tit for tat thing, right? You slap me, I slap you. It's not exactly the perfect system. In fact, in no way, shape, or form is it even close to a perfect system, but it has created at least some mechanism where countries have to pay some penalties if they don't follow some very basic rules. But as a practical matter, the WTO isn't particularly stringent. I mean, it's relatively hard to break the law under the WTO. Now, in addition to the WTO, there's many regional agreements, such as North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which is between the US, Mexico, and Canada. And this is essentially a free trade zone. Right, so there, for most tariffs between the US and Mexico and China or China and Canada have been eliminated. Right, so there are no tariffs on most goods and services that move between these countries. Another kind of common regional agreement is the European Union. And so you are all familiar with Brexit, right? Brexit was the UK getting out of the European Union. And of course, why was this so chaotic is because basically, England has something close to 40 or 50% of its GDP goes to Europe in trade. So this basically changed the tax structure on almost half of everything produced in England. So this is a dramatic change. It continues to be a very dramatic change for the British economy, one that almost certainly will not be a good thing. So that basically leaves 27 countries that are currently in the European Union. European Union is different from NAFTA in one important way. It is a free trade zone. It is also a free migration zone. So if you are a citizen of one of these 27 countries, you can migrate to any of the other countries. If you're a German, you can move to Britain, or you can move to France, or you can move to Spain. This is, of course, one of the other reasons it was so complicated for Britain to get out of the European Union, is that there are a lot of Brits that live in Europe, right? In fact, there's a lot of Brits that live in Spain. There's parts of Spain, having been there a couple of summers ago, there are parts of Spain that feel more like England than London feels like England. And so it was, it's a big change then for these people to find out, oh yeah, you just can't live in Spain willy-nilly. You actually have to formally migrate. You have to get a visa and you have to get a permit and all this kind of stuff. So it's a really big change. And then on top of that, there are bilateral agreements. And bilateral just means country to country. So for instance, the US has bilateral agreements with many countries, most importantly, South Korea, Chile, Japan. So the US has a lot of one-on-one agreements with many countries. And so, listen, it's a complicated situation, right? It's a complicated situation. Now, to this point in class, we've been talking mainly about trade in goods and services. But now I want to talk about the movement in capital flows. Because this is just as an important part of globalization. Right? In a very real sense, finance is more globalized. It is much more globalized than trade in goods and services is. So when we talk about trade, we really have to consider the financial aspect of this. And once again, I think that's a part of the whole globalization process that many Americans and many policymakers, quite honestly, just are not as familiar with. They just don't quite understand all the implications of this globalized financial system. So let's talk about this a little bit. First off, just to see a little bit of data. Here you can see what's called foreign direct investment. And you can see what's happened to these flows, inflows and outflows, right, over time since basically 1980. So this is a little hard to read because everything is black and white, but you know, whether you're talking about US inflows, US outflows, or the world inflow outflow, you'll see pretty much the same story. There's a lot of volatility here, but the trend has been going up. Though of course, it got a severe beat down during the global financial crisis of 2008, right? Where before 2008, we'd really reached record highs. Since 2008, you know, was a pretty significant reduction in global flows, global capital flows. When we talk about capital flows, there's two types that we should be familiar with. There's what's called foreign portfolio. Jeez. There's called foreign portfolio flows. And foreign direct investment flows, okay? Foreign portfolio flows and foreign direct investment flows. What's the difference here between the two? For some reason, I didn't leave myself any room to write, but foreign portfolio flows are basically buying and selling bonds, stocks, bank accounts, other financial assets. So for instance, if somebody in China buys a US government bond, that is a foreign portfolio flow, meaning it's just buying a financial asset. Foreign direct investment is when you set up a foreign factory or foreign branch. And you basically control the operations of that investment. Okay, so in many ways, the big defining difference here between these is one of control. Okay, if I go buy a share of Sony stock, okay, I'm engaging in foreign investment, right? I'm engaging in foreign investment. But am I really taking control of Sony? No, I'm sending money to Japan, right, when I buy that share of Sony stock, but I'm not really in any way, shape, or form controlling how that money is used. Now, if Apple sets up a factory in Tokyo, then they are controlling how that money is used, right? They are directly controlling how that money is used, right? And so in portfolio investment, there's really no control In foreign direct investment, there's a lot of control. Of these two, which is the most valuable to a country? Which of these two foreign portfolio flows or direct investment flows are countries most hungry for?
Investment flows.
Investment, what do you say that, Zach?
Because you're like actually building something. I
Yeah,
would say.
right? Foreign direct investment, because you're building, you're creating jobs. But most importantly, this is the avenue by which a lot of technology transfer occurs, right? So, you know, when Toyota builds a factory in Tennessee, that is a great thing because yes, it creates jobs here in the US. That's great. But it also becomes a very important source of technology transfer, right? Likewise, if you think about a less developed country like Vietnam, which of these are they most hungry for? They're starving for foreign direct investment. They want foreign companies to come and set up operations. Why? Because they'll train their workers, they'll train their staff, they'll develop human capital, they'll learn some technology, and then these are the people who will eventually go out and start their own businesses, right? And so, yeah, foreign direct investment is just a very, very useful thing. Now, who's the world's biggest recipient of foreign direct investment? Well, let me ask you first, what's the world's biggest source of foreign investment? Of every country in the world, which country provides the most foreign investment to other countries? The US. And who is the world's biggest recipient of foreign investment?
Probably the US or China.
The US, right? The US is both the world's biggest recipient of foreign direct investment and the biggest source. And this is just a testament to the globalized US financial system. We are big lenders, right? And we're big borrowers at the same time. Relative to the size of their economy, China is relatively small players in foreign capital flows. And we're going to talk about why that is here, probably more tomorrow. But the simple answer is China's financial system is closed. It's relatively closed. There's some reasons why they keep it closed, but it's actually relatively difficult to get money into and out of China. And so as a result, China is not a particularly big source of capital, both in and out. So this is one of the dynamic things about the US economy, right? Is that we are huge recipients of inflows and we're huge recipients of outflows, right? We have a very globalized financial system, and that's in many ways, and we're going to develop this more tomorrow, the US is the global financial system. And in a real sense, the US dollar is the global currency. Right? We'll talk about some of the ramifications of this tomorrow. to make sure we understand this a little bit better, let's just talk about what determines capital flows into and out of a country. Let's just make sure that we're clear about what are some of the factors that play a role in capital coming into or going out of a country. What are some of the things that we have to think about here as economists to help us understand this? Anybody? Same currency. Well, in general, you're not going to have the same currency between countries, but you're right. This is an argument for a monetary union, right? I'm going to say this another way, Sonny, and say currency risk, right? What's the risk that's involved in holding another currency? Many countries have gone into a monetary union, like the European Monetary Union, as essentially a way to encourage capital flows between the countries because you don't have to worry about changes in the value of different currencies. The US dollar is generally seen as very attractive and as being low risk. That is one of the things that certainly means that the US is going to be a big recipient of capital flows, is because of the unique position of the dollar. We'll talk about this a lot more tomorrow when we talk about exchange rates. But certainly, you know, most people in the globe are a lot more open to taking and holding dollar assets than they are to holding, for instance, Mexican pesos, right? There's just, the dollar is a much more global currency than almost any other currency in the world. Or, well, definitely more than any other currency in the world. Even global currencies like the euro, right, are not nearly as attractive to most investors as dollars are. Right, so that is certainly one of the things that makes the U.S. a big recipient. Right, is the kind of unique role of the U.S. dollar. What else? Think about it this way. What other things make the U.S. a particularly attractive place to put your money if you're a foreigner? What are some other factors?
Institutions are really good here.
Right. Your institutions, right? Things like stable financial markets and having good governments that are not just going to take your money, or debt tolerance, right? These things are all related to each other. That makes the U.S. an attractive place to save, is because we have pretty good institutions in general. Maybe somewhat related to this, having a strong economy, right? I mean, this is particularly true of foreign direct investment. Why would another country or a multinational firm want to establish production in your country unless they think that you have a strong economy that has lots of human capital, physical capital, and technology to take advantage of? So in many ways, though this seems kind of backwards, You would think that, well, won't poor countries be the biggest recipients of foreign direct investment because they need it? Well, yeah, but the more you need it, the less likely you are to get it, right? In some sense, the less you need it, the more likely you are to get foreign direct investment, right? Because, you know, and the less you need it, it means the more of human capital, physical capital, and technology you already have, right? And so, yeah, you know, that's kind of this situation where, yes, Mexico's much more in need of foreign direct investment, but who gets it? Well, the U.S., right? Because we have a lot of the things that really attract firms to want to set up business, right? Including, you know, big markets. I guess I should say that as well, right? Why does Toyota have so many factories in the United States? Because the US is their biggest market. So Toyota wants to make cars close to where their customers are. The final thing, right? S minus I equals X minus M. The bigger the difference between savings and investment, the more capital inflows or outflows that will take place. Once again, this is just kind of a simple math. So why is the US the world's largest recipient of foreign capital and also the largest purchaser of foreign capital? Well, these really four things. The US dollar is a very attractive place to hold your money, right? If you're going to hold the currency, holding it in the dollar is very attractive. We have reliable institutions. We have a strong economy, and we need to borrow a lot because of this big difference between savings and investment. And as we talked about a minute ago, this twin deficits phenomenon. That governments that borrow a lot are also going to borrow a lot from foreigners. And so this is what you see when you look at the data, right? If you look at what's happened to US-owned assets abroad, meaning the assets that Americans have purchased abroad, they've gone up in general since 1980. And what happens to the amount of assets that foreigners own in the US? They've also gone up, right? So both our foreign inflows and foreign outflows have gone up by quite a great amount. So the US has a very internationalized, right? A very internationalized financial system. Let's talk about here, just in the last couple of minutes of class, let's talk about China and the US. Because China always seems like it's at the tip of our tongue whenever we talk about these global issues. So I do want to spend a little bit of time making sure that we kind of understand this relationship here between China and the US and what exactly is going on between these two countries. First off, let's think about this equation for both countries, because this equation helps us understand a lot about what's going on between the two countries. What's true in the US? We have low savings. And big government budget deficits. What's the result? We run big trade deficits. And also, our net foreign savings is less than zero, meaning that we are a foreign borrower. How are we a foreign borrower? Well, basically, other countries come in and buy our assets. They buy our government bonds, they buy our stocks, they buy our corporate bonds, they buy real estate in the United States, they buy a lot of different assets. Those are all really ways that we borrow from foreign countries, is by foreigners buying our financial assets. Notice that that's not in and of itself a loss for the United States, right? Borrowing from abroad, meaning that can be actually very good for us, right? It allows us to get money today. In many ways, China is just our enabler. They are really the flip side of this coin. While the US has low savings relative to investment, China has very high savings. Savings rates in China, it's, as with a lot of the data in China, is a little bit hard to say confidently, but savings rates are probably between 30 and 40% in China, right? People save a lot. And so there's very, very high savings rates in China. What does this mean? Well, this is one of the things that drives their big trade surplus. And gives them positive net foreign savings, meaning that they are a foreign lender. How do they lend? Well, they buy up a lot of financial assets, including, very importantly, US government bonds and other sorts of financial assets. So what you have here is you have what a psychologist would call a codependent relationship. Right? Both of these countries are essentially relying on each other for things that they think that they want or think that they need. The thing about this, though, for our purposes, is to understand that to both countries, there are costs and benefits of this relationship. Okay, to both countries, there's costs and benefits. Let's think about this. For China, how do they benefit from this relationship?
They get to sell their goods at a higher price, normally, I'm guessing.
Sell their goods at a higher price. Yeah. No, I don't think that's what China's benefiting from. I mean, and they're not selling their goods at a higher price, right? Because in a global market, selling at a higher price means that, maybe your goods won't get sold. Yeah, they're really trying to sell their goods for cheap because what are they trying to do? What's the major thrust, or one of the major thrusts of Chinese economic development policy? Right? This has been to rely upon exports, right? This is that whole export promotion. Right? This is a way for them to increase their technology, to increase jobs, and take advantage of comparative advantage. So China sees running big trade surpluses as part of their development strategy. This is how they're going to get rich. This is how they're going to increase their productivity, is they're going to make a lot of goods that they can sell abroad as a way to increase productivity over time, increase wages, accumulate more technology, become a developed country. Right? I mean, for China, this is the key benefit. This is the key thing that they're focused on. But this comes at a cost. What's the cost for China? Look back here. What's the cost for China?
They're really dependent on now everyone kind of buying and from them and lending, or not lending, borrowing their stuff.
Right. So first off, China makes a lot of goods, but do they make it for Chinese people? No, right? One of the flip sides of this is consumption in China is actually low. And by that, I mean, if you actually look at how most Chinese people live, their standards of living are lower than what you would expect based on their GDP levels. In part because most Chinese people face a lot of incentives to save and not to spend. And the government essentially encourages that, right? China produces goods to sell to other countries, but not necessarily to sell to Chinese citizens. And so encouraging savings is a way of essentially making sure that you export a lot abroad. But what you're not doing is you're not consuming it domestically. So, you know, I take a class to China every couple of years. And one of the things that we definitely do is, you know, we actually go into people's homes and see how they live. And I think it's always a bit shocking to people to see when you go into a middle class home in China, really the material differences in standards of living between most Chinese people and most American households. Now, listen, you go to a middle class household in China, I mean, globally, it's good, right? I mean, you know, middle class people are, you know, they have all of the modern, what we would consider necessities of life, right? So I'm not saying that people are living in a thatched hut with no running water or whatever. But if you just actually look at the way that they live, right? You know, they don't have, you know, 18 streaming channels and 5 closets full of clothing and 3 cars and all of these kind of things that, you know, many Americans take for granted, right? Their actual standards of living look kind of thin relative to Americans. And so, you know, but this is in part a reflection of their policy, right? That our American policy is developed much more around domestic consumption and consume, consume, consume. China is much more about savings for the future. This has facilitated growth, but in terms of how people actually live, it keeps standards of living relatively low. Another thing is it's surprisingly hard for most Chinese people to borrow. Because where does a lot of their supply of loanable funds go? Abroad. right? So you have this strange situation where China is lending money to the US, which means that there's less money available out there for Chinese people to borrow. And so the Chinese financial system is actually, I mean, this is a topic for 2 or 3 or 4 days of class. So we're not going to get into this, but it is not a system that serves the average Chinese family very well, right? Most Chinese families have very little access or relatively little access to financial services that we take for granted in the US, in part because of this system. How about for the US? Well, for the US, it's really kind of the flip side of the coin, right? We get benefits and we get costs. Some of our benefits are the costs for the Chinese. So what do we get out of this situation?
High standards of living.
Exactly. We get a lot of consumption and cheap borrowing. We can spend, spend, spend. Of course, there is a relative cost. And what's the cost to us? Right? What's the cost to us of this situation? Yeah, Sonny, I think you've nailed it. We have trade deficits, which are likely a drag on employment. And we accumulate a lot of debt. So as I said, there's a codependent relationship here between the US and China, right? A codependent relationship where each country is in some sense getting something out of this that they want. But the question is this healthy? And I think most economists would say probably no, that in essence, what's needed is some rebalancing. In other words, these countries have taken such big extremes that both countries should probably be moving toward the middle a little bit more than what they're doing. In other words, the US should be consuming less and China should be consuming more. The US should be borrowing less, China should be borrowing more. It's probably a more sustainable path. But the key is these countries would have to change policy. They have to change domestic policy. The US is not going to stop consuming more and accumulating more debt until we begin to think seriously about policies that would encourage more savings. So I missed this in the chat. Somebody asked a couple minutes ago, can this practice of savings be attributed to cultural dynamics, right? So in other words, this the high savings in China and the low savings in US reflect culture. To some extent, I would agree culture plays a role, right? You know, my grandmother grew up in the Great Depression, and let me tell you, she was a damn saver, right? You live through horrible times like that and you save. One of the interesting things about going to China is if you talk to anybody over 60 years old, they've lived through some horrible times in China, right? Horrible. And so, you know, it is true that the older generation in China saves a lot, in part maybe because of culture, but just in part of history, right? But then there's also very much a policy bent towards savings, right? China's tax policy is very consumption orientated. So it taxes consumption very heavily, which in essence encourages people to save. In the US, we don't tax consumption, we tax investment, or I'm sorry, we tax income, which encourages people to spend, right? And so in many ways, our government's tax policies, and then also our government spending policies, where the federal government in China doesn't run big deficits, but the federal government here in the US does, all of those things impact our savings rates as well. So Faye says culture and policy is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, and I would agree, right? I would agree. To some extent, policies that encourage savings can be influenced by culture, right? But I think there's a large mix of things going on. But to me, you can't say it's only culture, because it's very clear that in China's case particularly, there is a purposeful policy to encourage savings because they realize that's an important part of export promotion, right? So they're not engaging in export promotion just kind of accidentally. This is a purposeful policy that they know the best way to encourage exports is to encourage savings. Why? Because they understand this equation, right? They understand that equation. If you want to increase your trade balance, what should you do? You should save more. And so, yeah, you know, that's so there's a mix of reasons why this is happening, but I think most economists who look at this, try to look at this objectively, say both countries tend to need to meet more in the middle, right? That China could probably do a little bit less savings in a more domestic consumption. US could probably do with a little bit more savings and a little bit less consumption. That would put them in a more sustainable path in the long run. So I'm going to let you off here. Tomorrow, we are going to talk about exchange rates. Tomorrow's our exchange rates day. So if you read through chapter 18, you'll see that that's really the part of chapter 18 that we have not got to. So we're going to talk about exchange rates, what determines exchange rates, how central banks can manage exchange rates, kind of all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of like the last big topic of new material that we have to cover. So make sure you take a look at that. Remember, this afternoon, your quiz, number 5, our last quiz, will not be on anything that we've talked about this morning. So it will only be on chapter 15 on monetary policy, which we talked about last Wednesday, and on chapter 16 on inflation, which is what we talked about on Friday. Okay? All right, so anybody have any questions before I let you go to lunch? Okay, well, have a good lunch, and we'll meet you back here at 12:30. Make sure that you come prepared with questions. As I said, we won't be covering new material this afternoon. It'll just be a time for you to ask questions, and then when you're ready, we'll take the quiz. Okay, thank you, everyone.